everyone. My name is Sarah Farid, and on behalf of the Inter-Council Network, I would like to welcome you to our webinar. This webinar is being offered by the Inter-Council Network of Provincial and Regional Councils for International Cooperation as part of an ongoing, and the Canadian Council for International Cooperation as part of an ongoing effort in sharing information and building capacity on timely subject matters with our members and sector colleagues. Today's webinar on preventing and addressing sexual misconduct in Canada's global development and humanitarian sector is indeed a timely one. It was a little over a year ago that the Me Too movement against sexual harassment and sexual assault became viral. The magnitude of the problem became evident, particularly in the media, music, and fashion industries, in sports, but also in politics and government. The military and religious institutions, and became increasingly evident that even the global development and humanitarian sector was by no means immune. Sexual misconduct, harassment, and assault are an ugly reflection of some deep-rooted systems of power that underlie social values and determine behavioral norms. Many organizations in the sector have challenged these systems of power that have also contributed to the denial of human dignity and fundamental human rights, vulnerability, marginalization, and impoverishment.
Is that better?
And yet we find ourselves just as much part of these systems, entangled in them ourselves.
I can hear Sarah, but
This webinar will address how the sector in Canada is seeking to address this issue. It is merely the start of a conversation with organizations in the sector. And we hope this conversation will extend and include and involve organizations of all sizes across Canada, working on various themes and parts of the world, regardless of their affiliation. We will be sharing the work of the Canadian Council for International Cooperation Steering Committee today and hope to identify next steps as a broader community. And sorry, actually, can you give me one moment here? I understand that everybody's hearing the French translation. So if you give me 10 seconds, I will try to address that right now.
And I'm still hearing myself. This is the intro.
All right, I'm hoping the team at the Canadian Council for International Cooperation can let me know whether it's a bit better right now. Excellent, I see a thumbs up. Apologies for that. So presenting today are Julie Delahanty, Executive Director of Oxfam Canada, and Martin Settle, the Executive Director of USC Canada. Julie is a leader on gender equality and human rights with more than 20 years of international development experience. She was formerly the director of CEDA's Gender Equality and Child Protection Division and has written extensively on issues of gender and employment, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and globalization. Martin is a feminist activist who's advocating collaboration and participatory inclusion across USC Canada as an organization and in its programming, with a focus on giving space to the most marginalized voices. He has provided leadership to children and youth programming in the United Church of Canada, developing safeguards within that context before retraining as a chartered professional accountant and joining USC Canada. Before I hand this over to Julie and Martin, just a few additional logistical matters. Julie and Martin will be presenting for 40 minutes or so. There will be 50 minutes for a question and answer period, 15 minutes. You should see on the screen a chat box called Q&A. We ask that you write your questions there. If that doesn't work for you, there's also a chat box at the bottom, which I will be monitoring. So if somehow you don't see the Q&A box or it doesn't work for you, then please feel free to use that. I will be monitoring both. Participants on the Q&A have the opportunity to vote on questions that they would like answered. At the time, I will read out the questions that have the highest votes. Our Francophone participants are welcome to post questions in French. If there are any participants that are currently on the webinar that would prefer hearing the presentation in French, kindly send an email to one of the organizers who will provide you with the call-in information. After the webinar, you'll be asked to fill out a satisfaction survey. Only once you have completed the survey will you be getting an email back with the webinar recording and a PDF of the presentation. You'll be receiving these in 2 weeks' time, and without further delay, I will hand this over to Julie and Martin.
Thank you very much. We are, I think, going to have the PowerPoint put up. Can people see the PowerPoint? No PowerPoint yet. Okay, well, I will begin talking. We have already had a great introduction. Thank you very much. Just jumping around the PowerPoint a little bit, we have first off a quick agenda. Some of that was given already in terms of the space for our presentation and the questions, but our hope is to cover a little bit of the background of the Sexual Misconduct Steering Committee of CCIC and our work to date and our future work, and then have a bit more of an in-depth dive into the Leaders Pledge specifically before moving into questions. So I'm going to set us off. If we could just skip through 2 more slides in the projection. To speak a little bit about the history of the steering committee and the background of it. Many of you will recall that back in January and February, news really captured global media attention around abuse that was occurring in a program in Haiti. And that really galvanized a lot of the larger funders. I think it's important to say that this isn't a new issue. This is questions of safeguarding and protection of people in humanitarian and development programming have long existed. There's reports going back into the 1990s of detailing investigations and statements in those times that there were systemic issues that needed to be addressed within the development community, primarily within the multilateral organizations, the UN and connected to peacekeepers and others. But in January and February, the story really broke headline news and impacted on some major international organizations and reflected poorly on some of the governments that were funding some of those organizations as well. And so in February of this year, Global Affairs approached CCIC basically to say, we want to talk about what's going on. And CCIC pulled together a group of, I think, about 12 organizations. I wasn't part of it, and so I'm going on the notes to discuss with the minister and the deputy minister the standards that they already had in place, the work that they were doing to address and prevent, and to really start talking about what more needed to be done between Global Affairs and the civil society community. That led shortly thereafter, in the following week, for CCIC to make a commitment that was broadcast to all of its membership and publicly, that it would be forming a steering committee to coordinate the sector on its engagement around this issue, and also to be looking at reviewing its own code of ethics. So CCIC has a code of ethics and operational standards that all members are expected to comply to. So the 80-some members of CCIC have all committed to this. It hasn't been looked at for a few years, and so one of the commitments CCIC made was to look at that code of ethics and to review it and update it in light of the needs that were going to be coming out of this. But at that time, they also announced the desire to form a steering committee and asked for nominations or people to volunteer to serve on the committee, looking for 10 members. On March 26th, they then announced the initial committee membership of actually 13 members. The intent was to create a committee that had broad representation of the wide variety of organizations that were involved in humanitarian and development work. And so, so about half of the organizations involved are humanitarian network or humanitarian in focus. And then the remainder is a mix of academic development organizations and networks. So the ICN community is represented through OCIC. There's also representatives of the Emerging Leaders Network of CCIC. The committee met for the first time on April 26th and really focused on, at that point, starting its steering or terms of reference. And the terms of reference was reviewed by a variety of people, both on the committee and off the committee, to ensure that it was meeting the needs of the CCI community, but also looking a bit broader. And so the key objectives of the steering of the, sorry, things happen on my computer and I get confused. The objectives of the steering committee are really summed up in the first sentence of the terms of reference objectives. So the steering committee seeks to facilitate coordination, discussion, and consultation within the sector on best practices related to the prevention of and response to sexual exploitation and abuse, and identify immediate and ongoing next steps to ensure responsible and accountable practices in this area by Canadian organizations providing development and humanitarian assistance overseas. I think there's a couple of key things to note from that. One is that the committee does not see itself as necessarily being the sole place that this work happens. That the committee is here to facilitate the whole of the sector in engaging in questions, not only around the prevention, but also around the response. We will, as all of us believe, have a significant responsibility to ensure that we're doing everything we can to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse, sexual misconduct, as the steering committee is broadening that work. But also the recognition that despite all of our best efforts to prevent, it is likely that at some point there will be failures. And so the other key piece is, how do we choose to respond? How do we seek to respond to those? Coming out of that, there are a number of key commitments that the committee has made, particular specific aims around providing the forum, around developing capacity across the sector, but then also specifically, and I think this is of more interest to the regional council networks, to look at how as a sector we can work together to develop some shared infrastructure so that we are supporting one another in our capacity and supporting one another in meeting the demands of this work. One of the critical issues is that specifically in terms of response, investigation, the reconciliation work following, but even in terms of developing of policies and procedures, small organizations don't necessarily have the capacity to carry that on our own. So we are significantly looking at ways that we can create a shared infrastructure. The committee sees, as stated in the objective, the committee sees itself as providing this forum for the entire of the Canadian sector, not necessarily specifically the CCIC membership. But as we develop shared platforms and shared systems, we may need to consider how the resourcing and responsibilities for that are shared beyond just the CCIC membership, but also significantly to draw in support from global affairs, to recognize that that as a nation we also have a commitment to ensure that our work is free of sexual exploitation and abuse. So the committee is meeting once a month. It's resourced by staff from CCIC. Again, at the moment, there is no specific funding for this mandate, and so CCIC membership as a whole is carrying this work. We are meeting monthly to really focus on the next steps and where we're going to go. We have had meetings already with Global Affairs, who have their own internal working group on this issue. Julie and I, as co-chairs, are largely leading that engagement with Global Affairs, but reporting back to the full committee and to the full CCIC membership. The committee is established as a standing committee within CCIC, so we'll have over time rotating memberships. Of course, we are new to this, so we're only 6 months in, and so it's still the initial membership that is involved. The steering committee members are expected to be part of the the committee both as representatives of their organizations, and as such they're expected to be key leaders within the organization, either from the organizational hierarchy or within the within specific mandates to have responsibility for prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. The members that we have all committed to bring that and represent that from their own organization, but they're also expected to engage with their own experience, their own expertise, and their own time. So the committee members are asked to commit at a minimum to a year, but the expectation is that we will need to have ongoing and rolling membership as time goes on. So at this point, we are still kind of forming, but in the long term, we will be seeking other committee members, and engagement with the committee beyond its membership is going to be critical, as all of us across the sector seek to build in ways to handle this issue. I'm going to leave it there and hand it over to Julie, who's going to talk more specifically about the key activity we've done so far, which is to develop and circulate a pledge for leaders.
Thanks so much, Marty, for getting us going, and thanks a lot to everybody who's on the webinar. It's really, it's such an important issue, and I'm so glad to see that so many people are interested and wanting to hear more about it, both about what we're doing and about the issue more generally. Is it loud enough? Can everybody hear? If there's any issues, just chat. So the first big thing that the committee did, as Marty mentioned, was to put together a leaders pledge on preventing and addressing sexual misconduct. And that was really a statement of commitment that all of the sector leaders were going to agree to sign. So presidents, CEOs, executive directors would all sign this pledge. And by signing the pledge, committing to a set of concrete actions and recommendations to prevent and respond to sexual misconduct. So, sorry, just go back a little bit longer. There were a couple of things that we recognized we needed to think about as part of this, or were sort of rationale behind the commitment. One was generally that we have a duty of care when it comes to the work that we do internationally, but also within our own organizations. So taking responsibility for that duty of care that we have. Understanding really the power imbalances that are inherent in the work that we do. I don't like that word inherent, actually, now that I think about it, because it implies that we can't change it, and I think that we can, but there are power imbalances that exist as a result of the kind of work that we do. So understanding that, and understanding the increased need to do more to make changes. And then finally was the issue around having a survivor victim-centered approach, or more of a trauma-informed approach. And I think that a lot of this is things that we want to do. It's not to say that right now everybody is doing this right or well, but it's things that we're really committed to making sure that we do better in the future. So some of the commitments included things like establishing a culture of zero tolerance to all forms of sexual misconduct in all the work that we do. Strengthening existing organizational policies and practices to prevent and address sexual misconduct. We committed to meaningful transparency and accountability. Ensuring all allegations were investigated and that perpetrators are held to account. We agreed to work towards reforming recruitment and vetting processes to stop offenders from moving through and between organizations, supporting victims and survivors, and have I missed something? And recognizing and tackling power imbalances and gender inequalities in all of our organizations. And I think it's really important to recognize, and Marty has already said this, that the steering committee recognizes that not everybody is at the same place when it comes to having these policies in place and the kinds of safeguards that you might have within your organization. And the commitment is really for all of the leaders to be committing to doing more, and for us as a sector to commit to do more together, to work together to try and find solutions for those organizations that don't have the same capacity or the same resources as others would to implement some of the policies that are required. So the document was developed by the steering committee. It was launched at the CCIC annual conference, and we have a lot of signatures so far. I'm not sure exactly how many we're up to now, but it's about 40? Between 40 and 60 organizations have signed on. Mostly CCIC members. I'm not sure if we have any non-members, but we did open it up to non-members, and yes, I'm getting some nods that there are some organizations that have signed on who are not CCIC members, which is great because it really is a sector-wide issue, and we need everybody to commit, whether they're members or not. Though of course everybody should be a member of CCIC. The pledge is very ambitious in what it's trying to do, but we think that it is achievable also. And we definitely know how necessary it is to have this kind of a pledge and the kinds of policies and safeguards and procedures that need to be in place. So that's generally the work of the pledge. I hope that you've all seen the pledge. We have a link at the end of the document for you to link to it and hopefully to sign on. And again, people can sign on to the pledge whether they've done all of those, whether they have all those things in place or not. The idea is that we're pledging to do it in the future, and we'll be monitoring how well people are doing in terms of making good on the pledge. But you can sign it without actually having had all those things in place so far. So that's what we wanted to say about the pledge. And then we have that we've done. So Marty, maybe I'll just on the goals. Sorry, little technical confusion here and my presentation confusion. So I'll just go to some of the goals before we complete this section. So some of the goals of the pledge were to identify, support implementation of, and monitor best practice and continuous improvements of these best practices. Support between members and partners, as I mentioned. Having a more survivor-centered, victim-centered approach to reporting and investigation, and understanding what that looks like and what we need to do to make sure that that happens. Ensuring appropriate training and increased understanding for all staff within our organizations. Empowering communities, so having the right kind of pathways for community reporting and support. Protecting informant safety, so that often means whistleblower policies or different kinds of policies and procedures to protect informants. Joint efforts with regards to the employment cycle. So this is a big issue around having perpetrators moving from one organization to another. It's a very complex issue related to privacy and safety of employees. But the sector as a whole is working on that, and the sector, I mean that globally, not in Canada only. And the Canadian Committee, at this point, we're following what's happening internationally in order to see where the best practice is going to come out and be able to spread that amongst the Canadian population as well. We're talking a lot about resourcing, how we resource this. It isn't inexpensive to do the kind of training, repeated training that's needed to ensure that people are safe. So how do we resource that? We're having conversations with Global Affairs around how that can be included into programs, etc. And finally, enabling staff to share learning and struggles. And I think that's a really important part of it, is having regular discussions with your staff around what this all means and how we can all do better together. So that's it now with the pledge. So on the activities, Marty, I'll start and you can keep going. What do you think? Sorry, we didn't plan this part very well. So we had a large consultation between global affairs and civil society organizations that was an addendum, part of the regular consultation that CCIC has annually with global affairs, and this year it was on PSEA. We had a very interesting discussion with quite a few more than usual global affairs participants, and a really good conversation on a whole variety of issues. There is a report that came out of that if you haven't seen it, it can be sent through the channels that are available. So that's part of it. We've also been working on a repository of resources. So getting all of the policies of all of the organizations. At this point, it's mainly steering committee members. There are 10 steering committee members, so all of the resources that they have, so our policies on PSEA, on harassment, on whistleblower, on whatever codes of conduct, whatever are the various resources that people have available to them, so that if other organizations are developing new policies or procedures, they have some resource to go to look towards. And I'll pass it over to Marty for the next couple.
So a key piece of our steering committee work we see is really connected to the Leaders Pledge, raising awareness and really trying to bring people on board. There's a recognition that while any one of our organizations can do the absolute best we can in terms of developing human resource systems, onboarding, culture development, reference checks, as much as we do, we are also dependent on each other. And it's incumbent on all of us across the sector to try to reach that high standard, so that the failings of one don't transfer into the failings, to a potential risk for others. And so we will be looking at a variety of things to try to engage not only the CCI community, but the broader community. This webinar is one of those first steps of trying to engage the organizations that are involved in the regional councils, and bring on board the inter-council network. We will be looking at doing a broad survey, which again will try to circulate through not just the CCIC membership, but through all of the regional councils as well, who are equally engaged and concerned as CCIC is on these broad issues and on maintaining our sector's responsibility and direction on this. So part of that is also just exploring what really the sector needs. So doing surveys, doing some regional roundtables. We're looking at specifically to do a roundtable, particularly in Quebec in French, but then also in other areas across the country as our time and resources and the regional councils are able to support, to not only get information from other organizations, but to really share the information and the best practices as they're developing. Again, we don't see this as a one-time thing. This living into these responsibilities is going to take us a long time. Our committee is committed to that long run. CCIC is, and we want to engage people to continually get better. One of the critical issues within that is also thinking about where are the key resources who have skill and who have background in this. A lot of the larger organizations, and particularly the humanitarian organizations, have already got people trained to do investigations, that are really thinking about what are the best practices in terms of hiring, in terms of job evaluation and work evaluation, but also in terms of what do you do in terms of investigation of allegations? How do we handle reports of allegations? And those people are committed to both their organization, but are also committed to doing this for the world. And so to try to identify who those people are, where they sit, and what capacity they might have to serve as resources to the broader community. And then, of course, our real intent in doing this is to get everybody else on board. So if you hadn't read the pledge before, hadn't known of the pledge before, we'd certainly encourage you to look at it and read it, but not only to talk about it within your own organization, but to talk about it with other organizations that you're in contact with. You know, it is a matter of the water will drain to the lowest point, and so we want to raise all of the points so that all of us are trying to implement the best practices, not only for the protection of the people we specifically work with, but the protection of people that others work with as well. And that's a critical piece. It is a shared responsibility, and we recognize very much that the resources for this, particularly in smaller organizations, are hard to identify. It's hard to think of prevention for something that seems like a modest and minimal risk, need to take a priority in the scope of shortage of resources that we always are all feeling. But the recognition, on the other hand, that this is something that is a critical piece of our responsibility in even beginning to undertake this work. And so we're working towards that. We are seeing I'm seeing a number of questions come up around repository of resources, and we're just really beginning that task of developing that repository. And not only will that repository be made public through the system that we're developing with the steering committee, but we're also, of course, always open to people adding to it. And so, again, in terms of the sharing of knowledge, if you already have policies around safeguarding, policies that might be informative to other members, we would certainly welcome you sharing them with the steering committee and those repositories. We are trying to, at this point, still sort out where does that repository live and how is it accessed. But the critical piece is that our intent is to make sure everybody has access to resources as they're needed, when they're needed, and at the level that are appropriate for the organizations that are coming in.
I just could answer a couple of questions. One is who you would write to, and I think the answer is to CCIC, to Rochelle Daly, who's, I don't know if the email, you have it, but I think that it could be sent to you as part of this forum. So she has the repository. So she is the person to contact, both for signing the pledge, I think, as well as getting access to the resources. And a couple of you have asked who is on the committee. So in addition to Marty from USC, myself from Oxfam Canada, we have Lindsay Blatting from World Vision, Grant Carioni from CARE, Nina Nazarchova from Canadian Red Cross, Marlon Mondaka from Save the Children. Oh, I see, and Carol Tishaw is part of the time. They're doing a share. Rachel Vincent from Nobel Women's Initiative, Denise Burns from Oxfam Quebec, Tracy Foster from CUSO International, Michelle Bilodeau from Département International des Jardins, Susan McGregor from Humber, Kim Gibbons from OCIC, Brittany Lambert, who's the ELN representative, also Oxfam Canada, and from CCIC we have Rochelle, Gavin, and Nick. So those are members of the committee. Other questions that we want to open up at this point? I don't know who is managing the questions.
Julie, I'm glad to be managing the questions at this stage. Are you ready to be taking questions, or would you like to continue your presentation? I'm happy to pause right now and do that.
I think that is the end of the presentation. It's just asking people to sign the CCIC pledge, and then we have a big question mark.
Excellent. Okay. I'm happy to go through the questions. I'll just answer one that pertains to the recording and the sharing of resources. Yes, the webinar is being recorded. It will be available online on the ICN communications platforms, and I'm certain through CCIC as well. And the presentation along with the links is also going to be available directly through CCIC, but everybody who is registered for the webinar and is attending will be sent also a satisfaction survey, and everything will be accessible at the completion of the survey. At the end of the survey, there will be a link there. We do appreciate you taking the time to complete the survey as well. So that's that. In terms of other questions, so you responded to the question about resources. There's also a question in the chat box about somebody who would like to develop a new code of conduct for their teams in Africa, and also safeguards, and what might be, right now there is sort of a repository of resources, but what are other mechanisms for the sharing of good conduct, good documents and good practices that you would suggest?
At the moment, from the committee, I mean, there are lots of resources out there on all of these issues. From the committee, what we've committed to do is to try and collect resources that already exist from within our organizations. So I think CCIC has been collating those. In addition, Marty mentioned earlier that we had a meeting with the minister early on in February, before the committee actually was struck. A number of organizations met with her, and at that point we were asked by Global Affairs to provide information about what all of us were doing, and I think that information, I'm hoping that CCIC is also collecting that information as well and putting that on the resource links. So the resources that we have, of course there's lots of resources out there for people, but from what we're committing to collect, it's our own internal policies and procedures, reports, lesson learned, etc.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, so an interesting question here about if we become aware of a complaint or an allegation through a project that is not funded or supported by us, what is our responsibility, and must we report this to Global Affairs Canada?
We are still, one of the things that we did early, and actually I had meant to mention this in terms of the background, Minister Bibeau on May 25th sent a letter to all of the funded NGOs funded by Global Affairs, essentially saying that they would have standards that they would expect all funded organizations to meet with respect to PSEA, Prevention of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse. And one of the specific things in there was around notification and reporting of allegations. And it was, we have written back to them to seek specific clarification on that, both in terms of at what constitutes an allegation, and you know, who in a sense, who is implicated. All of us, I shouldn't say all of us, many of us do work through partner organizations. We have in those partnerships delivery contracts that are often designed to meet our CRA responsibilities for care of charitable assets, and in those contracts often there are clauses around representation, and certainly an allegation at a partner that doesn't necessarily impact on our programming still does impact on the representation of our programming. I think it's a very difficult piece that we're really just starting to talk about at the committee, in terms of what is our responsibility in that partnership relationship, both in terms of providing guidance, providing best practice, providing a push for organizations to get better, but at the same time recognizing that we are separate legal entities, and so it is a difficult question, and I'm not sure I've actually answered it helpfully.
I think I can answer the second part of that question, which is, it's a fairly basic question around whether if an NGO partner is involved in something, but it has nothing to do with your project or the project that's funded, under the current way we understand it, there is no necessity to report that to Global Affairs. That doesn't mean that you don't need to do something about it from your own perspective and within your own policies. But the question about Global Affairs, if it doesn't relate to Global Affairs funding, there is no need for you to report it to Global Affairs. But that's something that we did clarify with them. It's the same as it would be with financial misconduct, where if it's not related, even if it's your program in another area that's not Global Affairs funding, they've been very clear that they do not need to know if it's not. That doesn't mean that we don't do things about a partner that we know about who is involved in misconduct issues, but just on the question around Global Affairs. And in terms of your responsibility, I think every organization would have its own policies, or should, or could have policies related to how you're managing your relationships with partners and what expectations there are around those relationships. So that's something that many organizations either have in place or are working on that could be shared again through the resources around what is the specifics around how we manage NGO relationships.
Fantastic, thank you for that. Sorry, Martin, did you want to?
Well, I was just also going to jump back in to note that I was just quickly running through the pledge, but we've had also a lot of talk around not only what is our responsibility to Global Affairs, but what is our responsibility to our broader donors and our broader membership in terms of transparency. And I think it's incumbent on each organization to think about what does it need to disclose within its own reporting, not necessarily to GAC, but through its public reporting.
Thank you for that clarification. So there are two questions that are sort of similar and have to do with gaining support for the pledge. So Christina asks, what barriers have you encountered in gaining support for the pledge, and are there ways organizations can help address those barriers? And then Rhonda asks, well, how can we encourage leadership to get on board for an organization that isn't currently a member? So what are the barriers, and then how can you incentivize people to participate?
I mean, I haven't seen that there's been a lot of barriers. People were fairly quick to sign on to it. We were, part of our work plan is to go through who hasn't signed on and contact them directly and determine why they didn't. Either they sort of missed the excitement at the beginning and they didn't sign on, or whether they have specific concerns. We haven't heard of people not signing on because they have specific concerns around the pledge. But it will be good to, when we have a chance to follow up with those members, in particular the members who haven't signed, hopefully we'll get a better read on why not, and whether they just didn't get around to it and are willing. So yeah, I don't think we've had any pushback or anybody saying that they don't want to sign it. So I think the barrier is simply awareness, making sure everybody knows that they can sign the pledge, that it's there, what it means for them, what support that they can hope to have as a result of signing on. So that's the kind of stuff I guess we'll hear when we're able to reach out to those that haven't signed.
I think that some of the concern and potentially some of the misconception might be around the resources that you're implicating yourself in signing the pledge. And the pledge is really written to think not in terms of what are we going to do that's going to cost us money, but what are we going to do to try to address the culture of our organizations, the operational policies and procedures of our organizations. So a lot of the investment that's required in the pledge itself and in some of the commitments to the pledge are around the time and energy to develop those processes and those policies, the time to connect, and that's partly why we want to make sure that we're providing the best-in-class resources to be able to say, if you need a policy for X, here is an example of one that works not only for Oxfam Canada connected to Oxfam International, but for the small two-person shop in Calgary. We need to, we'll be looking for resources that span across those types of organizations, but to recognize that we are asking people to make a commitment, and that commitment will require energy and effort. And we haven't heard of people not signing for that reason, but we also haven't asked. We haven't done any kind of way of saying who knows about the pledge and hasn't signed it. And so the key thing will be, as it gets disseminated through the networks, who are the people in the networks who are not signing, and for us to find out more as to why. So if you have concerns, let us know.
Excellent. So there's a question about if there are monitoring and evaluation tools that have been developed for this process.
Or, sorry, just to clarify, for the code of conduct?
I think it's for the entire sort of effort to address the prevention and addressing of sexual misconduct. So in terms of everything that the steering committee has done.
The steering committee itself hasn't yet done that. I think within our organizations, various organizations have that. So it depends on the nature of the conversation. But for CCIC, for this steering committee, we have not yet developed any kind of a monitoring evaluation framework.
Thank you. And there's a question about the CCIC's code of ethics and how that figures into the steering committee's work.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I know that they've been, I mean, Nick would be able to better answer this. I know that the board has been having a conversation about how to link the Leaders Pledge with the Code of Ethics and whether they need to add something into the Code of Ethics more specifically related to the Leaders Pledge. So that conversation is definitely ongoing, but I don't think that it's completed yet, as I understand it, unless someone from CCIC, they're saying yes, so I think that's the right where they're at with that, but there's definitely that conversation is happening.
I think we're hoping it's the other way around, that the steering committee's work is impacting on the Code of Ethics.
Yeah, just that the Code of Ethics, that the people working on the Code of Ethics, it's quite old, the Code of Ethics for CCIC, and I think they have been looking at revising it anyway. So I think that this, the work that we've been doing should, how that will play into their Code of Conduct is we'll see, time will see.
So there are a pair of questions related to Global Affairs Canada. So one is about rules concerning reporting on safeguarding incidents have been set by GAC. So have their rules been set? It was part of a Global Affairs civil society dialogue. And to add to that is, has GAC provided any information about what they'll do with the information received about reported incident investigations? And will they require the same or similar levels of scrutiny of multilateral partners such as the UNHCR?
Oh, I love this question so much. The only thing that we have received, other than the initial letter that Marty mentioned, we wrote back with a number of questions along these lines, including what will you do with the information? If you're asking us to provide it, what are you going to do with the information received? And whether they have also, whether they're doing it not only with partners, but whether they're actually doing it with themselves. So that's still so those questions are being asked. There is this, the one thing we have received is many of us have a clause, there's a new clause that is related to PSEA in the contribution agreements. There's been 2 that have been received in French and another one recently received in English. So that clause, we did have a chance to have a quick back and forth with them before the clause came out, though they didn't do a consultation on the clause. We had a lot of issues with the clause, the way it's worded, and whether organizations will be able to fulfill the obligations of the clause. So we have a meeting set up with the steering committee members and Nick, with the CFO, Arun, and the ADM of Partnership Branch, or whatever it's called now, at Global Affairs Canada, Caroline Leclerc. So we'll be meeting with them to discuss that clause and what it means. Again, similar questions, what they're doing with the information. The way it's worded now, it's fairly problematic. I mean, I think that they needed to put something into the contribution agreements, and that's not a bad thing. It's just would have been better if we had been consulted a bit more on the content of the clause, and hopefully they'll be open to some changes to make it more suitable for a wide variety of actors across the sector.
Excellent. So there's an interesting question from Jason. Second, effective prevention response mechanisms with partners require highly effective complaints or feedback mechanisms. These mechanisms would be used by partners as well as partner staff. Given cultural sensitivities and the self-interested action of perpetrators to protect themselves, this is a weak link in this process. Do you or others have experience navigating this, and can you share any success stories?
Oxfam does have quite a bit of experience with these feedback mechanisms and complaint processes in development and humanitarian settings, and we have lots of lessons learned around them and lots of innovative workarounds and increased amount of activity on this, obviously, since the Haiti incident, which was in 2011, by the way. So yes, there's lots of that out there. It's something I wouldn't be able to describe in a short period of time. So maybe Jason could be in touch with me or other. I mean, all of the larger humanitarian organizations would have that capacity to discuss that issue. So I could get him in touch with some of the people who deal with that.
And I think I would just add that this is something that's being thought about globally. You know, as organizations around the world try to move towards a more victim-centered approach, a lot of questions around what are the reporting systems, the alert systems that exist, how are they shaped in ways that that create safety for survivors, and also allow for an appropriate response that does segregate and isolate the perpetrators from that reporting process. It's not an easy thing, and I think this is one of the ones where I particularly am interested in seeing, you know, how can we work sector-wide in terms of looking at developing systems that could exist either as kind of a pan-Canadian approach, or even working with international organizations to make sure that there are not only kind of single and required procedures, but there might be multiple means and multiple methods through which reports could be made. We're, I think, at early stages of that. Oxfam really is the global leader in thinking on this, yeah, I'm glad that we have so many members from Oxfam working within our committee as well.
I just want to, if I could just add one other thing related to that, is that there are those mechanisms that we have in place, but it is about more than that. I think it's really about the risk that people face is also related to the kind of power dynamics that happen in humanitarian settings in particular, and the way that we do aid work. And I think there's been a lot of reflection around how to do aid differently so that those sorts of risks are lowered, including the localization agenda, which is more about putting more money and resources into the hands of organizations that are already working on the ground. Not that that wouldn't have its own issues you'd need to address, but I think there's a strong recognition that the culture change that's needed to address this issue goes beyond just having the right policies and procedures.
And along with that, the concern that we don't simply look to transfer the risk to our partners. Again, relating back to that question of what, you know, how do we handle allegations within partner organizations that aren't necessarily related to our programming. It's also how do we ensure that as funders of those organizations and as program partners, we're sharing that risk and sharing the concern around organizational cultural change that really is one of the biggest drivers of prevention.
Lovely. There are a couple of other questions before we wrap up here. So Jean-Marc, who had asked the initial question about his own programming and a code of conduct and safeguards, was wondering if he could do a follow-up later this week. So this raises the broader question: what is the mandate and capacity of the steering committee or individual members within it to support organizations that are seeking support and resources, or what mechanisms exist for that?
Great.
Alternately, maybe the second question, just so that we can wrap up after you answer, has to do with the terms of reference and if they could be available publicly.
Sorry, I've already forgotten the first question. Marty, do you want to answer it?
I got distracted by the second question too, but it was around the capacity of the committee to respond to individual concerns and support. I think that, again, going back to the means of communicating, the best approach would be to contact Rochelle at CCIC. We have already had a number of opportunities for engagement that have come to CCIC and have been put out to the committee. You know, recognizing that we all have other responsibilities within our own organization, but at the same time, we all have a desire to do the best for the whole of the sector. And so, so in the past, we have had questions put out to the broader committee that have been shared around and met. But again, I think this is a piece that we are going to have to address in terms of in terms of what is the capacity of the committee, but more than that, what are the resources that we are able to find and access to support this work? And that's one of the pieces we've already gone back to Global Affairs with, to say, hey, you know, we want to do this, you want us to do this, help us to do this. And so we will be looking for financial support that will hopefully allow us to have a staff person who is more dedicated to this and could serve as a bit more of a resource. But I'll leave that in Nick's hands.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's, sorry, I don't need to add anything to that other than to say that we are actively working on this in terms of funding to Global Affairs, and we'll have a concept note that will go to them, or has gone to them already. It will soon. So we will be following up, and I think it's absolutely necessary. While the committee members are all willing and able to support you know, individuals coming forward and asking questions, that's not a very satisfactory resource center. So I think we need to think more about how we institutionalize the resources, because the needs are obviously fairly high.
And with regard to the terms of reference, and if they can be shared publicly.
Oh yeah, they can be shared. Yeah, we'll send them.
I think I already tried to, but I'm not sure the link was clickable. So.
Well, if they are shared, then that, along with the report from Global Affairs Canada and the wording of the clause, if that's also available publicly, will be in the sort of the package of resources that participants will get at the end of the webinar. So to conclude, thank you so much again, Julie and Martin, for your time today. Again, Julie Delahanty is the Executive Director for Oxfam Canada, and Martin Settle is the Executive Director of USC Canada. To our participants, thank you for joining us. A special thanks to the team behind the scenes, Rochelle and Mona at the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, Kimberly Gibbons, the Executive Director of the Ontario Council for International Cooperation, who chairs the Intercouncil Network's Webinar Committee, Diane Connors at the British Columbia Council for providing technical support, and last but most importantly, Michael Carter, our interpreter today. Before we sign off, a quick reminder that a survey about this webinar will be sent to all participants at the email address you have provided upon registering for this event. We really do appreciate your participation in the survey. It really just helps us, you know, develop programming that is appropriate to your needs. Yeah, to access today's presentation will be available in both official languages. So if you're interested in joining us for future webinars, the best way to stay connected is to join our webinar email list, and a link to this will also be made available. Thanks again to our presenters, our participants, and the team organizing. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.